Now, back to the Larry King Show from Washington, D.C. Larry is off tonight. Sitting in is Dirk Van.
Yeah, it was 25 years ago this month. A beloved president was shot down in Dallas, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Jack Anderson is our guest on the Larry King Show, and we're talking about Jack's information, leading him to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the lone assassin, that there was a conspiracy to kill JFK. And we're taking your calls. Let's go to Washington, D.C. Hi, your question for Jack Anderson.
Yes, Mr. Anderson, I have two questions. First, part of your premise, as I understand it, is that Lyndon Johnson did not want to reveal a possible Cuban involvement in the assassination because of his concern that Khrushchev might react in a violent manner. How does that square with Johnson's willingness a year and a half or 2 years later to send American troops into Vietnam, which certainly would have aroused the Chinese as well as the Russians? Second... should I put the second question now?
Well, let me respond to your first question while it's still fresh in my mind. The problem was Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was cornered, was dangerous. They were very worried that he might respond in an impulsive and in a dangerous way. A year later, he was no longer running the Soviet Union, and there was less danger of some impulsive act. The action also in Vietnam was not really an attack upon the Soviet Union. It was a different kind of a situation. The Soviet Union had just backed down over Cuba, had just been forced in front of the whole world with the spotlight on it, had been forced to back down over the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a humiliating thing for a superpower to have to do. And then to have Lyndon Johnson come back just a few months afterwards and try to force them to do it again would probably have been more than they've been willing to do.
You have another question, Washington?
Yes, if you don't mind.
Yeah, quickly, please.
This is on a different subject. Mr. Anderson, I was wondering if you'd ever heard any stories or rumors concerning William Colby and possible activities of his contra to U.S. interests.
No, not really. You hear rumors, but William Colby is a patriotic American so far as I know.
Topeka, Kansas, hi. Topeka, are you there? No, okay. We'll take your call, 703-685-2177. This is the Larry King Show. Dirk Van sitting in for Larry, and our guest is Jack Anderson. We go to Taos, New Mexico. Hi.
Hello, Mr. Anderson. I'm enormously grateful to the Larry King Show for being able to speak with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
About the suppression of information in the media. I was in Boston at the time of the assassination, and because of a fragment of information that I received, I made a half-hearted attempt to lay my hands on a copy of the November 29th issue of Life magazine. And through an unusual chain of circumstances, I was able to get a copy of the version that was recalled. And it does show clearly that there was another individual in the car with the president in that party, a Secret Service man who was killed.
All right, Jack, do you have a comment on that? Thank you, ma'am.
No, I'm not quite sure what she was driving at, and I don't know that it would affect, actually, what finally happened.
Okay, thank you for your call. Fascinating information on the assassination of a beloved president, JFK. Our guest is Jack Anderson. More after these messages.
Now, back to the Larry King Show from Washington, D.C. Larry is off tonight. Sitting in is Dirk Van.
And we're taking your calls for Jack Anderson, our guest on the Larry King Show. Jack, before we get back to the calls, what is the role of the investigative journalist in America?
Well, he has an important role. He's the eyes, the ears, and sometimes the watchdog for the American people. The government belongs to the people. The people are the sovereigns.
Why are there so many secrets out there in government and industry, what have you?
Well, because human beings are running the government, and when they just like anyone else who is. When you're working for someone, you don't want him to find out that you've screwed up. And so the people in government don't want the people the taxpayers who employ them to know when they've made mistakes. They try to hide their mistakes. And sometimes, even though they haven't made mistakes, they feel insecure, feel that they might make mistakes. And so they would prefer to operate in the shadows. They don't like to operate out in the open with the sunlight streaming in on them.
If your account of the JFK assassination is on the mark, do you feel that the government botched a cover-up there?
Well, I think after 25 years, things are bound to leak out. And did leak out. But the government's going to continue to try to stick to the story. The FBI's credibility is on the line. The CIA's credibility is on the line. There's no way that the new president who once headed the CIA is going to want this story out. The Justice Department isn't. They've got a 25-year investment in the Warren Commission's findings.
Let's go to Dallas, Texas. Your call for Jack Anderson.
Yeah, Mr. Anderson, I watched your show the other night on TV, and I found it very interesting.
Thank you.
Being from Dallas, naturally, I've always been interested in the Kennedy assassination, and I have a couple of quick comments, and then I'll hang up and let you remark on them. First of all, did anybody ever figure out who exactly Oswald was working for and who set him up? And secondly, did you ever gain any evidence that John Kennedy's body was tampered with after the assassination because his brain was missing during the autopsy and so forth and so on? And I'll hang up and listen to your comments. Thank you.
To answer the last question first, no, I have no evidence that Jeff Kennedy's body was tampered with. And the first question was...
Sorry, I missed it.
What was the first question?
Oh, we'll have to move on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Dallas. Very sorry. We got a Tucson, Arizona. Hi.
Good evening, gentlemen. How are you tonight? Mr. Anderson, you mentioned towards the beginning of the show that Fidel Castro indicating that two could play the game of national leader assassination. If the American government didn't lay off of him, the American leaders, I think in your words, would not be safe. You then mentioned that 2 months later, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, obviously hinting that it was more than just a coincidence.
Yes, that's correct.
Could you give us some brief statement as to what kind of evidence you've uncovered that links the Castro pronouncement with the 2 months later assassination, number one? And number two, as I'm sure you will show us that there was a link, are you then suggesting that the complex, intricate effort to assassinate an American president was essentially brought to bear in a short span of 2 months? I'll hang up and listen to your comment.
Yeah, the threat was made on September 7th, 1963. Which was 2 months before the assassination. The CIA reached the conclusion. I reached the conclusion. I talked to some of my own sources, people who were involved in the assassination attempt against Castro, and this is what they told me. This is also what the CIA concluded. I don't know who the CIA sources were. I know that they had sources in Cuba, and that's all I know, and I don't know who they were, and this was their conclusion, that the plot against Castro had backfired. I don't have, as far as being able to do it in 2 months, no problem. It was, I think, September 13th, 1962, that the White House announced that John Kennedy would be visiting Dallas on November 22nd or 23rd. The first announcement gave 2 possible days. Santos Trafficante was a criminal partner. The CIA found that Castro had been working with Santos Trafficante. Santos Trafficante was a partner in crime with Carlos Marcello. Carlos Marcello controlled the Dallas underworld. 2 months would be enough time for him to work at this plot.
What would it take to reopen this investigation, Jack Anderson?
I think public pressure. I think, in fact, if the folks out there want to add to that public pressure or oppose it, if they think the dead ought to be left alone, they can write to me still, and I'll give you a post office box.
Do that now.
Post office box 2300. Post office box 2300, Washington, D.C. And the zip code is 20013.
Okay, we'll repeat that address for you if you would like to write to Jack Anderson.
Yeah, just to tell us what your vote is, and we'll add it to the total we already have.
We're going to have to break for messages. Back shortly with our guest, investigative reporter Jack Anderson, and we'll be right back.
This is the Larry King Show, live from Washington, D.C. Sitting in for Larry tonight is Dirk Van.
And we've got Jack Anderson with us. Let's get right back to the phones. We got to Rockville, Maryland. Hi. Rockville, your question for Jack Anderson.
Yes, I wanted to ask him about his knowledge back in the 60s with Drew Pearson, who he worked with.
Yes.
About the assassination.
Yes.
Because I find it somewhat difficult to believe they didn't suspect something back then.
Yes, I began to hear about it in the 60s, and I began to write about it very cautiously because I could only write about what I could prove, and there was very little proof at the time. It's much easier to prove it now because time has elapsed. For example, this undercover policeman that I talked about, a man named Joe Shyman, kept his mouth shut for 25 years. He's now 82 years old. I guess he was afraid of risking his life by talking openly before. But at age 82, 25 years later, he feels a little more secure. And so people are talking now. Evidence is available that simply wasn't available then. But we did write it in part at that time.
Same town, Rockville. Your question?
Hello.
Yes.
In your show, when I was watching the show a couple nights ago, in your show there was a lady that was dumped off the side of the road. What was her name?
Rose Jeremy.
Whatever happened to her? And
Rose Jeremy, as I recall, was murdered.
After she was taken to the hospital, she got out and was murdered?
Yes, a year or two later. That's my recollection, and I don't want to be held to that because there are so many facts, and she is one of the minor witnesses, although a key witness in this sense. For those of you who didn't see the show, Rose Jeremy was dumped off the roadside by a couple of guys heading for Dallas. She was babbling, it seemed incoherent, about the president going to be shot. The president's going to be shot in Dallas. We had the head psychiatrist of the Louisiana State Hospital on the show for the first time. And he said that he was called in and to listen to her, and he concluded that she was sane, that she was just a little incoherent. And then 2 days later, the president was shot in Dallas. And that, when somebody like that knows about it in advance, you've got to wonder.
It's interesting, fascinating what Kennedy himself said the morning of November 22nd in Dallas. This comes from Kenneth O'Donnell, then Special Assistant to JFK. He said the president was well aware of the risks involved in public appearances, and he quotes Kennedy as saying, on the morning of the assassination, now, this is Kennedy, he said, if anybody really wanted to kill the President of the United States, it would not be a difficult task. All one had to do was get into a high building someday with a telescopic rifle, and you couldn't defend against it. Kennedy on the morning of the assassination. Eerie, isn't it?
Almost as if he had premonition.
Toronto, Canada, hi.
Yes, Mr. Anderson, two quick questions. The first is, can you tell me what you might know about the story of Dorothy Kilgallen, her involvement and how she was, her mysterious death and so on? And the second one is, I always have believed it was Bobby Kennedy's war and organized crime that had triggered the assassination based on most of your evidence. I'm just trying to understand how Bobby's war and organized crime and the operation to get Castro combined. Was it that this unique combination of those two, or would they have gone after JFK even if there had not been any CIA-Cuban involvement? Would the mob on its own have enough motivation based on RFK's war on them to have gone after it without the whole Castro scenario?
I can't help you on the Kilgallen thing. There's not much I can add. There isn't much I can tell you. As to the mob and the Kennedys, originally they liked Jack Kennedy. In fact, they stole votes for him. They stole votes for him in Chicago. And they even used to take credit. Now, what I'm telling you is a matter of record, because the Justice Department tapped the phones of the mafia leaders, and we know what they were saying to one another. And at first they liked Kennedy, and then Kennedy cracked down on the mob more vigorously than any president had ever done. And, of course, it was his brother who was the real mafia hater, and his brother who was responsible for the crackdown. So this hatred turned very bitter. They even talked on the telephone about killing Kennedy. So, yes, they started out liking him. They felt that he had betrayed them. In their own minds, they'd helped to elect him. Of course, he didn't solicit this help, and they felt that he had double-crossed them and betrayed them, and that was a major factor. So at first, when this plot first came up, they liked Kennedy. They were willing to help him go after Castro. By the time the plot backfired, their whole attitude toward Kennedy had changed dramatically, and they were willing to help Castro at that point kill Kennedy.
Frightening thought. Do underworld figures routinely choose up sides in a presidential race?
No, I don't think so. It was just that some of their friends were close to Kennedy, people like, and I don't mean this to reflect on Frank Sinatra, but that Frank Sinatra and his crowd, some of them were friends of and liked by top leaders of the mob, and they were also friends and close to John F. Kennedy. I think for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Go to Cranford, New Jersey. Hi, come on with your call for Jack Anderson.
Mr. Anderson, I'd like to ask about the Social Security, being that's in the budget. Shouldn't that be out? I mean, the government can't touch that money. And it seems to come up every year when a budget is presented.
Well, Social Security can be touched. It traditionally has not been, but all Congress has to do is to pass a law. Some of the funds were actually diverted to other purposes. Some of the funds have been diverted to other purposes. But at this point, I think you've cut me on that. I don't think that they can touch the Social Security funds under the present law.
Investigative reporter Jack Anderson, a man who breaks stories and makes headlines. He's our guest on the Larry King Show. We'll be back after these messages.